Countdown to Halloween 2022, featuring eerie and uncanny tales of haunts, ghosts, and suspense. The first Monday of every month at exactly midnight, a new story will appear on Storylink Radio's YouTube channel as we count down to Halloween 2022. Plan to catch these each month or you'll miss one. Each story will be 13 to 30 minutes long. And now, tonight's story from Storylink Radio. The Deathwatch by Hugh B. Cave. First published in Weird Tales, June 1939. In a way, it was my fault. But I had known Elaine Ingram for years, and when she asked me for the details of her brother's passing, I could not force myself to tell her the truth. When she said to me that night, right after the funeral, "Did he ask for me before he went, Harry?" I lied to her. Well, I had to. Yes, I said. He kept asking for you. He kept saying how much he loved you. And did he say he would come back? Elaine whispered. Yes, I told her. Yes, he said he would come back. She and her husband, Peter Ingram, took over the old house out there at the edge of the swamp. Peter was a writer. He could make a living anywhere. And Elaine insisted on moving in because she said Mark would be coming back sometime and he would surely return to the house in which he had died. For 6 months they lived in that house. And I got to be pretty good friends with Peter. He'd come over to the radio station every now and then and sit with me while I was on watch. Sometimes in the mid-watch, which is usually dull around 4 in the morning, he'd poke about asking questions, and I'd tell him what I knew about being a radio man. Peter had a natural aptitude for that sort of thing, and before long he could have sat there at the Bug and worked a shift without much trouble if I dared to let him. One night Peter was sitting there, watching me, and when a lull came and I leaned back to light a cigarette, he said suddenly, "Harry, I'm worried about Elaine." No, I knew what the trouble was, all right. Elaine was convinced, you see, that her dead brother Mark would come back to her. She just sits there in the living room, never says a word. Old Iago sits there with her. Harry, I've got to do something about it. It's driving me insane, man. Well, why don't you get rid of old Iago? Well, Elaine likes him. This Iago had lived in various shacks around town for as long as I could remember. He claimed to be a Seminole Indian. He drank a lot, and folks said he was queer. Whatever he was, Elaine had taken a fancy to him and hired him to work around the place. And now he was living there. "Oh, Harry," Peter continued, I've got to convince her that she's wrong, that the dead don't come back. But, well, she won't talk to me anymore. If I sent Iago away, she'd just go deeper into those damned books of hers. I thought it over for a few days. One day I said to Peter, "Why don't you read up on spiritualism? I mean, you can't expect to argue with Elaine unless you can talk her language, right? Study this stuff for a while, and you'll be able to pick holes in it, man." Peter was fooling with an old amplifier which had been lying on my desk. He looked up at me, stared a moment, then nodded. And I didn't see him again for 2 weeks. Then Bill Macy said to me one day, "What the devil's Ingram up to? I was in the post office this morning and I have a dozen boxes of equipment for the Beacon Radio Company addressed to him. I thought the man was a writer." "The poor guy's got to have a hobby of some kind," I told him. "He's lonely." But that night, to satisfy my own curiosity, I figured out an excuse for calling on Peter, and I drove out of there around 9 o'clock. It was a black night. When the nights get back in Florida, they're like ink. I drove slowly because the road was bad, and I could hear the frogs grunting in the swamp all around me. And after a while, I saw the lighted windows of the house. You can't imagine a house in a place like that unless you've lived in Florida, seeing some of the leftovers from the boom. This place was enormous. Had about 12 rooms. It looked like a small hotel, very ornate and elaborate. And yet it was the only house for miles around. As I remember, some wealthy chap from New York figured the town would grow out that far and sank a small fortune in a house, and then realized his mistake. He put it in the hands of an agent who couldn't sell it because who would want to live miles from the civilization on the edge of a swamp filled with snakes and gators and bugs? And so the agent rented the place to Elaine and Mark and their mother. This was before Elaine was married to Peter Ingram. I think they paid $20 a month for it. Then the mother died and Elaine was married and Mark stayed on alone. He was a radio man, a good one. But the house, I don't know, the house did something to him. We at the station noticed the change in him and begged him to move into town. But he bought a lot of books and told us to mind our own damn business. He gave up his job in August. Bill Macy relieved him one morning at 8, and he said to Bill, tell Crandall I'm through. Just like that. When I heard it, I went out to the house and begged him to reconsider. I told him it was unfair of him to quit like that without giving me a chance to get a man to replace him. He stared at me. There was a queer, dull light in his eyes. And his eyes, I don't know, his eyes never blinked. I'm sorry, but I have work to do, he said. For another month, I didn't see him. Then the rumor spread around that he was sick, and I went there to find out. He was sick, all right. That queer, dull light in his eyes had become a wild glare that scared me. He looked half-starved and had a raging fever. I drove back to town, and I got Doc Wendell. And that night, while Doc and I watched over him, Mark died. Now Elaine and Peter and old Yago had the place. When I climbed out of my car that night, Yago opened the door to me. Hello, Yago, I said. Is Mr. Ingram at home? Yago nodded. I followed him inside into the living room. It was an enormous room with a big fireplace and lots of musty furniture, and Elaine was sitting there reading. Yago limped over to a chair near the fireplace and paid no more attention to me, and Elaine looked up and said,
Why, hello, Harry.
I've got a swell story for Peter. Is he around?
Oh, yes, he's upstairs.
She didn't get up to go after him, but just sat there, staring at me. She was a good-looking girl, Elaine. A little bit on the short side, but slim, trim, with very even features. She seemed tired, though, and I could see that she hadn't bothered much about her looks lately. Careless, I suppose, because they didn't have many visitors, and she seldom went anywhere except to the village. I'll go up and talk to him then, I said, but she shook her head.
No, he's working, I'm afraid, and he won't want to be disturbed.
There was something queer in the air. I didn't exactly know what to do. I could have laughed it off and gone up to Peter's workroom anyway, but something in the way Elaine was looking at me gave me the creeps. Well, yeah, I guess it is pretty late, I mumbled. Maybe I'd better come around at some other time. But just then I heard a door open upstairs and Peter called down,
Is that you, Harry?
When I went up, I saw right away that he was in bad shape. He was wearing slacks and slippers, no shirt. He needed a shave and looked all in. He couldn't have looked any worse after a week's drunk. Been a long time since I seen you, mister, I said. He nodded and kept on nodding for a moment while he stared at me. He seemed to be making up his mind to do something, and then rather abruptly he gripped my arm and said,
I want to show you something. Come.
His workroom was at the end of the hall, and he didn't release my arm until we were inside with the door closed.
Even my wife hasn't been in this room for the past 2 weeks. Look.
I looked. My mouth sagged open. It was a big room, reeked of stale cigarette smoke. The shades were down. I guess they'd been down, the windows too, for a long time, and the whole back end of the room was piled up with radio junk. What the devil? What are you doing, Peter? Building a broadcasting station?
Look it over, Harry, look it over.
I looked it over. He had some ultra-shortwave apparatus that was unlike any ultra-freak stuff I'd ever seen. The receiver apparently was still in the experimental stage, with loose wires and disconnected condensers sprawled in a mess. The transmitter was what made me suck in my breath. I knew what this ultra stuff was all about, but the weird-looking amplifiers Peter had hooked up to his transmitter stumped me. He saw me squinting with disbelief.
Oh, don't worry. It'll work. I'm throwing the ultra-high frequencies clear out of the spectrum with that amplification hookup.
Well, about all you'll do, I said to him, is drive the boys of the station mad, interfering with our reception. Well, what's more, you haven't even got a license.
For what I'm doing, I don't need a license. Besides, it's far from finished. I'll be a month working on it before I'm even ready.
I walked over to his desk, and he had a stack of radio books that would have tested the learning of an advanced electrical engineer. I started to look them over, but he said gently,
Oh, never mind those, Harry, never mind those.
He pulled open a drawer. There are more books in the drawer. Books of a different sort.
Some of these books were in the house when we came here. Mark must have been studying them, Peter said. Others I obtained by mail from a collector.
I skimmed through a couple of them, but it was all Greek to me. Stuff about Beth Mora and the Black Legs of Holly, and more stuff about voodoo and the dark arts. Oh, hell, I said. Only a nut would bother wading through that junk. What's eating you, anyway? What's...
She reads it,
Peter said. Who, Elaine?
Yes.
You mean she takes this junk seriously? He nodded. I didn't like the way he stared at me, or the way he handled those books when he replaced them in the drawer. He seemed to resent my disbelief, and he touched the books lingeringly, almost reverently. Then suddenly he said,
Elaine mustn't know about this. You understand? She thinks I'm working on a novel here.
Well, that's what I thought too, Peter.
Well, now you know better. But you mustn't tell Elaine.
Well, I told him I wouldn't tell Elaine. I told him, too, that he could stand some sleep, and if he didn't ease up a little, he'd find himself in bed with a nervous breakdown. His answer to that was a crazy kind of laugh, and the same sort of laughter kept coming in little gusts from way down inside him as he walked with me down along the hall.
I'll be over to see you soon,
he promised me. And he held my hand for a minute, and I felt his eyes on me as I went down the stairs. I turned and said, so long, and I walked into the living room to say goodnight to Elaine. Evidently, I didn't make much noise. Elaine didn't hear me coming. She was on her knees there in the shadows, and in front of her was a table on which stood a photograph of Mark. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, and her gaze was glued to the photograph. I thought she was praying. Naturally, I took a step backward and would have faded into the hall again without disturbing her. Then I heard the words that were whispering from her lips.
Hear me, O mighty Nyarlathotep,
She was incantating.
You who walk in the farthest shadows by the black lakes of Hali, listen to me, I entreat you. And you, O Haster, send him back to me. Give him to me as he promised to return.
I stood there, chewing my lips and gaping at her. It didn't make sense. It was a mumbo-jumbo that scared me, and I felt little shivers crawling over me. And then while Elaine went on repeating those same words, I saw Iago the Seminole. He was sitting on the other side of the room, staring straight at me. It was dark over there. His eyes were like red coals in the darkness, and I suddenly had a feeling that if I intruded, those coals would burn me. I'd had enough. I tiptoed out of there, and I closed the front door behind me as softly as I could. I got into my car, and I turned it around and drove back out of the swamp. That night, I stood the mid-watch and jumped at every slightest sound. My nerves were as tight as fiddle strings. Even the shrill crackle of code couldn't make me feel at ease, and once while I was working on the SS exhibitor, a big housewife spider came slowly through the open door into the operating room, and I went over backward with a shriek. I didn't go near Peter Ingram's house for 3 long weeks. I wanted to forget what I'd seen there. But then, one night, Macy was supposed to relieve me at midnight. At 11, his wife phoned to say he was sick, so I called George Latham's house to get George out. His wife answered. George was at the fight, so when he came in, she said he'd hustle him over to the station. At 1 o'clock, I'd been on duty for 9 hours and was all in, and suddenly everything went wrong. A Norwegian freighter was calling with important business, and a mad clatter of meaningless dots and dashes came out of nowhere to drown him out and tear my ears off. For half an hour, it continued unabated. When George arrived, I was a mental wreck, was cursing my head off. Listen to it! Listen to it! Listen! I said. And suddenly there was something else for us to listen to. It was the voice of Peter Ingram. For a while, it slurred up and down the scale, the way a phonograph sounds if you press a finger against the turntable, slowing it, then letting it speed up and slowing it again. We couldn't distinguish words right away because of the crazy variations in tone. But finally, the tone leveled out, and Ingram's voice roared through the operating room. George Latham and I stared at each other, and neither spoke. I don't know what he was thinking, but my thoughts were back in the shadowed living room of that big house on the edge of the swamp. I was standing there, with Iago's eyes glittering at me, and I was watching Elaine. Because the words that came roaring through the phones just now are almost the same words I had heard Elaine whispering on that other occasion. Something about the Black Lakes of Hali, about Nyarlathotep and Hastur, and Mark, Elaine's brother, who was dead and who had promised to come back. It went on and on and on, and we listened to it, and SOS could not have silenced the air lanes any more completely. Both George and I knew that every operator within listening distance was doing exactly what we were, forgetting his job and concentrating on that weird, crazy babble of words from Peter Ingram. Finally, George said explosively, "Been telling you for weeks that guy's goofy. Listen to him." I was listening.
Hearken to me, mighty Nyarlathotep, you who rule the midnight forest by... Hear me.
I'm going over there. For Peter's sake, I had to. For our own, too. The crazy fool was interfering with all kinds of important business. If he kept it up, he'd have the law down on his neck, and then maybe it would get back to us. We'd be criticized for having let him monkey around with the station. I didn't want to lose my job. I didn't want Peter to get in any trouble either, because, in spite of what I'd seen and heard, I still thought the world of Elaine. So George Latham took over, and I backed my car out of the station. I drove over to that house on the edge of the swamp. It was raining a little. The road was black and dangerous, and there was light in Peter's workroom, but the rest of the house was in darkness. I stepped into a pool of water at the foot of the steps, began cursing. The door was locked. I had to knock. Then I had to stand there for what seemed like an hour, waiting for someone to answer my pounding. Old Iago finally opened up. I said, "I want to see Peter. It's important." And I pushed past him. He turned to stare at me as I strode to the stairs. I could feel his eyes eating into my back. Not until I was halfway up the staircase did he close the door, and while I was hiking along the hall to Peter's workroom, I heard the Indian climbing after me. Peter's door was shut. I banged on it. The chair scraped inside, and there was a queer, heavy silence for about 10 seconds, which seemed a long time. Then Peter said,
"I'm not ready for you yet. Go back to bed."
"It's Harry Crandall," I said.
"Who?"
Harry Crandall. I've got to talk to you." The chair scraped again, and I heard footsteps. I should have been prepared, I suppose. I should have remembered how thin and emaciated he'd been on my last visit, but the door opened, and I took one look at the man and stepped back, cold all over. He was like a ghost.
"Oh, Harry, come in. I thought you were my wife," he said.
I kept staring at him. His face was dead white. His eyes were like holes burned in a sheet. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten for days. I was sure of it. His hands shook, and a bulging muscle at one side of his mouth kept twitching, and his breathing was hoarse and fast, as if the effort hurt him. He closed the door behind us. He put a claw-like hand on my arm, and he pulled me toward the desk on the other side of the room. The desk was a radio table now, of a sort. It was cluttered with wires and paraphernalia, and in the midst of the chaos hung a microphone.
I'm working on ultra-high frequency waves,
Ingram said.
This outfit here,
and he pointed to the transmitter,
is a special apparatus for throwing the signals outside of the known spectrum.
I put my legs wide apart, and I jammed my hands against my hips and glared at him. You weren't working the high-frequency waves a while ago, Peter, I growled. You raised hell with everything on the Atlantic coast.
Yes. I was experimenting then, and probably had some parasites. That's ironed out. Now I'm ready to begin.
I glanced over his apparatus. Now, I'm no Marconi, but I know enough about radio to know that ultra-high-frequency stuff is all in the experimental stage and damn deep. Evidently, he'd been doing a lot of reading. But the book that lay open beside the microphone was not a radio book. It was one of those dusty tomes from the desk drawer. It was full of stuff I wouldn't want to read unless I were good and drunk in broad daylight. Queer formula, queer names, rituals, all that stuff. Necromancy, I guess you'd call it. And some of those formulae, if I know my language, were in Arabic. What, this is what you were sending out over the air? He nodded. His hand was pawing my arm again, pulling me aside, and there was an odd expression on his face, a queer twist of anticipation, as he lowered himself into the chair. The hand that closed over that microphone was as thin and bony as the fist of a corpse.
Listen, I'll show you.
But I...
Don't worry. I'll not interfere with the station, But I have to say, we'll go out where no human ones have ever gone before. I've worked for weeks to reach out into the void. Tonight, just before you came, I had an answer.
An answer? From what? I said, frowning.
What? Well, I don't know yet, but now...
Well, I stood there and I listened, and before many minutes passed, I was cold as ice and afraid. Now, I'm a sober man. I've stood many a mid-watch alone, with wind rattling the windows and rain hammering a dirge on the station house roof, but the words that whispered from Peter Ingram's quivering lips scared me. It was the same old stuff at first, but the ghastly eagerness in Ingram's half-mad face made it different. The guy actually believed he was talking to someone. You could tell by his eyes, by the way he glued his mouth to the microphone. He mumbled Arabic, then went back to English.
Listen to me, Nyarlathotep. Hear me. I thought thee first with ridicule for my wife who believes in you. I would have proved to her that there was no life after death, no hope, no return for the departed. But now I would bring the dead back to her, and this is the night I have awaited. He died when the wind wailed as it does tonight, when the storm gathered. Tonight.
Peter Ingram was not talking for my benefit. He didn't even know I was standing there watching him, listening to him. When his voice trailed off, he still sat there, gripping the mic. His hands were shaking. Beads of sweat dripped from his wasted face and splashed on the open book in front of him. The room was still as a tomb. The rain whipping against the windows seemed to make no sound, and wind whining around the house had no voice. Not for me. My heart was sledging, and I was cold and scared. Something here was all wrong. In a kind of daze, I realized that. Weeks ago, Peter Ingram had dug his teeth into a study of this stuff in order to prove to Elaine that she was wrong on her beliefs. He'd been determined then to convince her that her dead brother never would or could come back. But now, now Peter believed all that Elaine had believed, and more. The man was mad. Listen, Peter, listen. Stop this business. Forget it. But he was whispering into the microphone again, paying no attention to me.
Send him back to her, Nyarlathotep. It was on a night like this that he died on his lips. A promise to return.
Grant him that dying wish this night. Let him return to her. Suddenly he stiffened, sat there with his eyes closed, began to tremble from head to foot. I took a step backward, staring at him. Listen! Listen, Elaine! Elaine, listen and answer! I swore to you I'd get an answer, and I have. I have. Well, I didn't hear anything. I told them later at the police station that I did not hear anything, and I repeated here, so help me, I did not hear anything. Peter Ingram sat there, sucking breath and gasping it out again, and I stared at him. And that was all. For about 1 full minute. 1 endless, horrible minute. That was all. Then I did hear something downstairs. The door opened, the wind hurled it shut again, and glass broke, so I knew it was the front door. Then I heard footsteps. These weren't the kind of footsteps you'd have made or I'd have made. They were heavy, house-jarring thuds that rattled the walls and shook the floor on which I was standing. They were slow, plodding steps. Someone down there had come in by the front door, which was locked, and was walking along the hall. Someone huge, heavy. My mind flashed a picture of Frankenstein's monster striding in out of the storm. Peter Ingram swung around in his chair and stared at the door. The door was closed. I think now that Peter expected the thing downstairs to come up and open that door, to come up and answer to the words he had mumbled over the microphone. But Elaine's room was downstairs, and the thing strode along the hall down there. And I heard a door clatter open, and then a woman was screaming. And oh, that scream! The sound came wailing up to us, shrill as the zero shriek of a hurricane. It ripped and slashed its way through the whole house, drowning out the yammer of the rain, the voices of the storm outside. For 1 long, ghastly minute it continued unabated, and then it became a hideous, gurgling sound, and I heard something else mixed up in it. I heard a guttural, snarling voice, and the sound of human bodies thrashing about in a death struggle, and the voice was a man's. "Damn you, Elaine," it bellowed. "You left me alone. You left me here to rot. Damn you!" And the voice became a grisly peal of mad, maniacal laughter. And the woman's screams were silent. About that time, I reached the door of Peter Ingram's workroom. I got the door open. I went stumbling down the hall toward the stairs, and the voice was still hurling out bursts of triumphant mirth. And it was dark down there, and I think I yelled out, "Elaine! Elaine, I'm coming! I'm coming!" But I'm not sure of that. I'm not certain of other things either. I do know that a scurrying shape sped along the lower hall while I was descending the stairs. That shape was whimpering and sobbing like a frightened animal, and it rushed to the front door, which was open, and it vanished into the night. It was Yago, the Indian. I do know, too, that Peter Ingram stood there at the head of the staircase and kept shouting,
"They answered me, Elaine! They answered me! They answered me! Elaine! Elaine!"
But Ingram was crazy. The doctor said he was crazy. Anyway, I got to the bottom of those stairs, and I found a light switch. I went stumbling along the lower hall to Elaine's room. The door was open. I would have rushed in if the light hadn't shown me what awaited me. The room was a shambles. Chairs were overturned. The bedclothes were all over the floor. The floor was red with blood. Elaine lay in a crumpled, twisted heap against the legs of a dressing table. I didn't have to go any closer to know that I couldn't be of any help now. I could see her face, her throat. Something with unbelievably powerful hands had torn her. I backed out over the threshold. I turned on all the lights, and I staggered to the foot of the stairs, and I stared up at Ingram, who was still up there waiting. "Come down," I mumbled. "Peter, come down here." But he just stood there. He just stood there, gripping the wall with one hand, the banister post with the other, and he kept shouting,
I've had an answer. Tell Elaine to hurry. I've had an answer. Elaine! Elaine!
I left him there. I staggered out of the house, and I got into my car, and I drove to town. When the police went there about half an hour later, they found Ingram pacing back and forth along the upstairs corridor, enraged because his wife would not go up to him, and they found Elaine in her room downstairs as I'd left her. Later, they listened to me. I told them exactly what I've told you. And they stared at me and exchanged glances and said firmly, Yago is the man we want. We'll find this Yago. We'll find him. But they didn't find Yago. They haven't yet. He was a Seminole Indian, and the Seminoles know every inch of the Everglades, every hiding place of the Great Swamp. No. Yago will never be found, and perhaps that's best. Because if they caught him, he might tell them the truth. Or what I think is the truth, and he might make them believe it. And then they would question me again. And I might tell the whole truth. I think about it. I think about it when I'm alone on the mid-watch. I hear the wind wailing out of the swamp and hear the frogs grunting. And I think of the night Elaine's brother died. Because in the very beginning I should have told Elaine and Peter how he died instead of lying to them. I should have told them that Mark was a raving maniac when Doc Wendell and I sat beside his bed that night. I should have told them that he not only promised to come back, no, he swore to come back. He swore in a mad outburst of rage to return and destroy his sister for having deserted him. The hours of the mid-watch are long and black, and more than once, on my knees, I have prayed for daylight. You've just heard tonight's story from Storylink Radio's Countdown to Halloween 2022. Remember to come back for our next tale. Many more stories of all genres available to listen to and read along with now on our website at www.storylinkradio.com. Visit our YouTube channel at youtube.com/StorylinkRadio. And visit our podcast for easy mobile listening anywhere, anytime. Just search for Storylink Radio on your favorite podcast provider. Oh, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and click that alert bell for Storylink Radio.